All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. I am going to share the URL that I'm using. You can click that and see what I'm presenting, and there will be some areas where you can do some things with some interactive code there. So feel free to click into that. I'll explain that a little more in a second. But to get started, my name is Stephen Mizell. I'm a director of product management at SmartBear. I work on a product called SwaggerHub, and we're an API design collaboration tool. I want to mention first that I'm not talking about anything from SwaggerHub today. I'm actually going to talk about a little fun personal project that I've worked on called Geneva. So everything I'm talking today they're my words. I'll be kind of sharing from that perspective. So thank you for tuning in today. These are, of course, very difficult times, strange times for people. And thanks for accommodating this new way of attending conferences. I really appreciate it. I've added a little bit of contact information there that you can find me as well. You can find me on Twitter. Also, feel free to email me any questions or discussion points that we don't get to cover in the comments here or in the discussion that I'm sharing today. The topic, of course, as I just said, is a tool called Geneva. It's a little way to make your YAML, whether it's OpenAPI, AsyncAPI, or really anything that's YAML or JSON specific, to make that dynamic. And I'm sharing it today as much of an idea as a tool. I'll kind of talk through the idea of it at a higher level. This can go both ways. Make sure, as I'm talking, think of the idea as well, not just the implementation of this. I started this way back in 2014, which makes it over 100 internet years old, which is just a comment about how quickly things move on the internet. I'm sure everyone is familiar. So if this isn't a good fit, feel free to take this, come up with new ideas. Hopefully it sparks some ideas for you. I'm kind of taking a little bit different approach with this. Instead of recording my presentation or going through some slides, I built this little site. I kind of wrote out everything that I'm going through and talking about for the purpose of if my internet goes down, if you're unable to see or hear the presentation, but also gives you a chance to look at the demos. It gives you a chance. I've made it in a way where you can actually try out some of the demos as well right there in your browser. So feel free to click around to explore things. It's okay if you're somewhere else and not listening for a little bit. That doesn't bother me one bit. And about the code demos, you'll see them throughout. There's an edit button. You can click it, make some changes, and then click done, and it'll rerun whatever code is there. And to a point, I just want to make sure that your changes are not going to change what's on my screen, and I won't capture anything that you're typing in there. It's all private to you. I'm not sending that anywhere. Quickly, the agenda. There are just kind of three different parts to this. One is I'll introduce Geneva and the idea behind it. I'll go through some use cases to explain how it can actually work within some real life needs, real life use cases, and then we'll bring it all together in the end with some closing thoughts. And if time permits, I'll handle some questions and some answers. I have my iPad over here, which is showing the chat. So I'll try to check this from time to time. If you have questions along the way, I'll make a couple stops to answer anything that I can in that short time there. So Geneva is a library that enables you to put code into YAML or JSON. It's not something that you paste like Python or JavaScript, but it is a way, in a sense, to let you write code as YAML. So I have a short example here. If you're familiar with YAML, this is an object with one key. The value is an array of two items, 40 and 2. This is calling a function. So anytime we see fn : it's calling a function. and then the arguments that are being passed to it are just whatever the value is. So here the function is add, and you can imagine you pass in 2 arguments, you get the result of 42. Just to show you how you can edit this, you can click edit, make some changes, click done, and everything will update for you in real time. Geneva just has 2 basic rules. I just mentioned one of them. Anytime you see FN : for a key, it's specifying saying, pass whatever is here through this function and put the result in its place. If you want to pass 1 value, that's fine. Or if you want to pass many, you can pass in an array. And the way that you can reference things throughout the entire document is with ref : So anytime you see something like ref full name is the variable, and it will pull in and replace whatever is there with the reference. So functions and references, that's all there is, and that kind of makes you an expert at Geneva now. So congratulations. I have mentioned here that there are lots of functions available within Geneva. There's Ramda, which is a library that has lots of different JavaScript functions. It has things to sum, things to map over data, things to filter data. There's probably at least 100 different functions. Good question here about making the font a little bigger. Also mentioned too, I've noticed a couple of talks, if you move the quality to HD, it helps out quite a bit as well. Let me know if that's any better, or if I can improve it a little bit. So Ramda adjunct is another library that has lots of useful functions to check things. Is this an object? Is this an array? And then JSON path, and then I have a little library called Saunter that lets you kind of walk through some data. So at this point, maybe you're asking, why would you do this to us? Why would you put code in the YAML as YAML? And I will be the first to admit this seems like a bad idea. I kind of started this in 2014 just as a proof of concept, almost kind of in a joking way that, look what you can do. You could actually add some code here. But as the years have passed, and I'm sure it was happening at the time, there were many specifications out there, or many tools in YAML that were doing this very thing of putting functions and references within YAML itself. So I want to point out some examples, and I mentioned here, I'm not pointing them out to say this is bad, this is wrong, but just to show that this is how people have been going about it over the last so many years. AWS does it. They have a format called CloudFormation, which is infrastructure as code. And they have a whole list of functions that you can use within their code. I have an example here of their join command, which is a little tough to read. If you look at it, it's calling a function called join. It's going to join by nothing. And it's referencing 2 different variables or 2 different values within this. So this is the kind of thing that you probably write in CloudFormation if you've ever used it before. And it's tough to write, it's tough to read, but it is happening there, right there in the YAML. Here we have some code that is in the YAML itself. The equivalent in Azure Resource Manager has support for templates. It's called ARM, and they have their own way of doing this, where it's not technically YAML, it's really values that go into a string. And you can see this right here. They have a format function call that positions 3 different values, which are parameters. You can pass in parameters into this code, and greeting, name, number to format, and then they reference those in this function call, greeting, name, number to format. So here, Azure as well is doing code. Their whole point is, and AWS, is to allow you to specify the way you want your infrastructure to work, and to be able to accommodate different builds or different outputs based on the parameters you pass in. So there is a real use case there that they want people to be able to generically define infrastructure and be able to build that on the fly based on the context. GitHub Actions has come out here recently. It's GitHub's CI/CD build pipeline. They have a YAML format, and they have several different functions you can use in here. I have an example here of them providing an if expression, where you can see here they make a particular value available called failure, and they're saying if there is a failure, then do this particular step. They have linked here to also many other functions they have. JSON schema, just as well, if then else. Of course, we have OpenAPI. At minimum, they have the ref keyword. And there's also server variables, which is very similar to maybe you have a template and you're specifying different values that go in different places. They're also looking at overlays for the purpose of transforming data one definition into another. So there's this kind of trend of that happening across all of these different formats that I'm showing. So I'm saying, see, everyone else is doing, not for the sake of, well, everyone else should be doing it, but for the sake of saying there's a trend happening here, and it's not as wild as it sounds to treat YAML as code, because really big companies and really important specifications have determined that it is a good way to think about it. But there is also a little bit of a shift happening to mention. AWS has created what they call a Cloud Development Kit, and it is a way to write their infrastructure as code in a regular programming language like Python or TypeScript, and then generating out the YAML or passing that into AWS, so you never have to interact with the YAML. And a whole company, Pulumi, if I'm saying that right, they have built a whole company around this idea of writing code for the purpose of infrastructure, code in a real language other than YAML. So you may have heard of the configuration complexity clock. Simply put, it goes, you write a configuration in real code. People look and say, hey, we can actually pull this out into some general purpose specification. You do that, and then you start adding to it until it gets complex. And some people will say, well, why can't we use a regular language to do this since it's so complex? And then you repeat, you keep doing this. And there's a chance maybe we're seeing that with some of AWS's stuff or some of the infrastructure as code. And maybe it's a trend that's starting to happen. But I mentioned here, it's to me, it doesn't get rid of the problem. There's always going to be this need to have more dynamic things happen with the things that you're writing. We're all familiar with the story of XML. We had XML schema, XSLT as a way to validate and transform respectively. And at some point we deemed they were too complex. JSON was simpler, YAML simpler to write, and we've kind of gone down the same path. We haven't gone as far, but there are some similarities and some similar patterns that are happening there. There are some direct use cases to this. As I mentioned, the one with Azure, they're wanting you to have different build outputs. One of the big reasons is that for this as well is that you don't have to have a full development environment set up. You can just use a text editor. A lot of times you can use it in your browser. So it makes the barrier to entry in one way easier. It does maybe create some difficulty in writing it, but in order to get started is pretty quick. Safety is another reason. If you're wanting your customers to write code, you want to run that in a safe environment. So the functions in YAML give both freedom and restrictions in order to make sure that you can run code, but it's safe. The idea behind Geneva is that you make a specification that's devoted to transformation to make the other specifications and other data formats, or just data itself, more simple to deal with. I want to now show some of how Geneva works and how it could be used within the context of some use cases. Quickly, I'll let you read most of this here. There are some notes about the examples. There's variables, which are just things that are passed in to the code before it's run. The definition, as you'll see down below, is the code itself, and the result is what happens when those are run together. And to note too, examples are truncated in the ones I have here. They're not valid or complete examples. One use case is reusability. We see this a lot when we're using OpenAPI or AsyncAPI or any of these things that use ref, JSON schema, where we want to use the same thing. And so we put it somewhere in our document, and then we use the $ref to make sure that it can, you can use it all throughout your document. I just got a note here that it says it's a bit small. Let's see. Hopefully that'll work out. So I'll show you here, you can edit the variables. If I just change this, click done, it's going to update the information down here. The way that Geneva works with reusing or referencing things, as we saw a while ago, is the ref colon. So here is a definition, OpenAPI 3.0 with everything else omitted, and the info objects is referenced to this variable that's passed in. So you could reference anything from anywhere within the document. It's document itself. Here's the results with the actual contents of that info in the resulting YAML that's provided. This does differ a bit from $ref. There are lots of rules around that are specific to the format, and you can use them together if that's of value to you, where you can specify all your schemas somewhere else. Maybe you're specifying them as refs themselves, and then you're using something like Geneva to reference them. So not pointing out here that you have to do that, but they can work in unison if that does provide some value. Another common thing is composing files together. If you've worked with YAML over time, the file gets huge. It could be thousands of lines long. It's tough to edit and modify and keep track, so we start to pull things out and make it a little easier to reason about. And Geneva has a function to pull in files from the file system. Here I've kind of mocked out the file system. So I specify a file called info file, and I run the function include to include this file, and it puts that into the resulting YAML. You can use the real file system modules in Node, and you could access real files. There is a little bit of a safety concern there that you probably have to take care of. But you can imagine lots of different uses for this. Maybe technical writers are putting a bunch of markdown files together, and you can pull those in for your descriptions. Maybe there's a team that is in charge of the security, and they manage that in one file apart from everyone else. Or maybe you separate out every operation into its own file so that you can work with them independently. To note, of course, the ref can work this way. But Geneva, of course, can also go beyond the ref function that OpenAPI and others have. Another really useful one is localization. The ability to write and reference things within your definition that will be specific to maybe a country. I've got an example here of specifying a language as English, and then I've just specified one vocabulary term here called user signed up description, and I'm saying this is in English. I'll talk about this in a second, but here I am saying for the description, get locale and the name of it, and the result will put that full description in there. So I don't have to even say this is English. I can say just here's the identifier for it, and it's going to pull in the right one based on whatever language I defined. Here is another feature of Geneva where you can define your own functions. I defined this get locale as its own function that takes one variable called term. It uses this special path function that Rand provides, and it says go to the locale variable, first get the term that you searched for, and then next get the language that's been specified up here and return that. So you can define your own functions to use throughout your code if you like. I mentioned here, this is one way to define functions. I'll let you decide if that's something good or bad for you. It does provide some ways to customize stuff like this, but maybe for you, if your functionality is a huge need, maybe it can get too complex for you. There's a question here, the file to include needs to be YAML format as well, or format is not a dependency here. Correct. Let's see, I think that is correct, that you have to make sure that it is valid YAML. I think it does a YAML parse whenever it pulls in that file. So I think that's correct. Another interesting use case is for base definitions. So you could consider a situation where every post request needs to have a particular response included on it. And I've added here just a common response that says, excuse me, take the responses that it finds and merge in this other response object that you're specifying. In the definition below, I have a function called to this post responses, and I just define responses as if it was regular OpenAPI. It passes this whole thing in and uses this merge function to merge them together, so that I can do this once, only write the things that are specific to this one path and one operation, and change and add things for that in one place as well. So here's the resulting value. Lastly, I have an example here of using templates. Geneva provides a template function that is mustache. So mustache is just a template format. It's standardized across a lot of different languages. And you call the template function, and it has access to whatever variables are specified in that current context. So here I'm just using mustache. I'm saying put here the environment variable the variable called env, and the result is it puts that in its place. You can use this to use anything from mustache to change maybe what a description is based on the environment that it's in. Lots of different uses for template. AWS has the exclamation join, which we saw was a little bit hard to read, hard to write, and it would be a lot easier if just if it was just a template that you could specify it in one way. I'll go to my closing thoughts. I have a few minutes left. There's a good question in here about, is it only in JS? And I'll kind of hit on that in a few minutes. That's a good question. So there's a lot more to Geneva here that I've gone through. You can check out the README. You can check out the library that it supports to see all the functions like Lambda. It has its own CLI so that you can execute files straight from the command line. you don't have to have a browser like this, or you don't have to be running JavaScript and run JavaScript files. You can just run a file itself. It has this special definition builder or configuration builder that's very similar to Azure's ARM templates, where you specify some parameters. You can create a parameter file that has your information that gets passed in, and it gets validated before the code is run. It has a REPL that you can use in the terminal. If you're just wanting to experiment with something without writing a file and running it, you can jump into the REPL and try it out. Geneva also allows you to pass in JavaScript code, not within the YAML itself, but you can build your own runtime and pass in libraries. And so you can add to or take away from whatever is there based on whatever your needs are. So you could limit the functions that are available to just a couple, and kind of walk into it if that's of value to you. Or you can make up your own JavaScript code. If something gets so complex that the YAML is just hard to read, you could rewrite it in JavaScript and pass that in. Additionally, here you can run, as we see, you can run Geneva right within the browser. There are a few downsides. Kind of back to the complexity clock. Is this better than writing code? In some ways, it may be. In some ways, when you're getting too complex, it may not be. And as we see, AWS has gone this new route. So there is a question about that. Is it too much to write this kind of stuff in YAML? It's not yet easy to debug. This is kind of a language on top of YAML, so there are some developer tools that aren't there yet. Like I said, this is more so the functionalities there, not the ecosystem that you would get from a full programming language. There may actually be some better tools. There's a really neat language called DAL, if I'm saying that correctly. It came out, I guess, a few years ago, and it's for configuration, programmable configuration, and it's really neat. And a big thing is you're no longer writing in the specification if you're using something like, say, for instance, in your OpenAPI. You're now writing in something new, so you may lose out on some of the editing tools that you would normally get. I'll quickly hit on this. I know I have 1 minute left. Things that could be next: define it as a standard rather than just a regular JavaScript library. To the question in the comments, make it more cross-platform. Right now it's in JavaScript. It would probably be better to look at things like Rust, WebAssembly, something that is more reusable. And then add support for real code like AWS's CDK. So I'll stop there. If the chat continues to be open, I'm happy to answer some things. Happy to take anything by email offline, or happy to answer some issues within the code or in the GitHub repo. So thanks for coming. Thanks for your time, everyone. I really appreciate it.